as President of the Security Council. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. The illegal so-called international coalition led by the United States and in another flagrant violation of international law, international humanitarian law, and human rights instruments committed another crime against innocent Syrian civilians. The warplanes of the coalition, and on the 13th and 14th of October 2018, targeted residential areas in the city of Hajin in Deir ez-Zor using internationally banned white phosphorus bombs, killing and injuring a number of civilians, including women and children. It is now clear for everyone that this coalition has fought everything but terrorism. Its practices prove that its targets and its goals are in harmony with the goals of terrorist groups. It has sown chaos, death, and destruction. It has defied the state authority, and it has assisted ISIL elements, moving them to the eastern part of the Euphrates to carry out its aggressions in Syria. In order to preserve the credibility of the Security Council, the Council has to launch immediately an investigation into these crimes to ensure and avoid their recurrence, and to end the presence of U.S. and other foreign forces in Syria, this illegal presence. The Security Council must prevent these forces from carrying out their plans to undermine the sovereignty and unity of Syria. Mr. President, military and political groups have been established without the Syrian government's participation. And I have to call these plans to suspicion, because these plans do not serve the interests of the Syrian people. To the contrary, they support terrorism under a political cover. Therefore, the creation of the Brussels Group and the creation of the small group, as well as any other entities without the participation of the Syrian government, will be counterproductive. It will not help achieve any progress on the political track, which is supposed to be a Syrian-led track. Mr. President, Syria is not under the authority of anyone, and there will not be another Karzai in Damascus. There was a meeting held for the so-called Group of the Friends of the Syrian People at the initiative of France in Marrakesh on the 12th of December 2012. It included 137 members. Today, it includes only 12. This group has failed because it was never a friend of the Syrian people. As simply as that. This is why the Syrian government does not recognize any roadmap that it is not party to and that it does not approve. The United Nations must not be part of any political groups that stand against Syria and the Syrian government, because these groups are being created outside the authority of the Security Council by political powers that support terrorism in Syria and in the region. Mr. President, the countries that supported the terrorist war against Syria and over the past 7 years have convened sessions within this council for grandstanding purposes. They have exploited the United Nations as we have never seen before. Hundreds of meetings on Syria, some formal, others informal, and others so-called area formula meetings, as well as side events, all kinds of meetings. These meetings were held every time the Syrian army was able to defeat the armed terrorist groups in order to exercise pressure, to put pressure on the Syrian government to hinder this progress. Today, we are seeing a new chapter of this policy of blackmail. After the achievements and the progress made in Astana, and after the Syrian government engaged positively with the outcomes of the Sochi conference, these same countries sought to create an illegal group under the name of a small group outside the authority of the Security Council to block any progress in Astana or Sochi and to turn back the clock, to hinder the political process. The Sochi process was the only process that was able to bear fruit, and for a simple reason, Mr. de Mistura, for the reason that the Syrian government was part of this process, and this is why it succeeded. Sochi succeeded because the Syrian government was part of it. These countries tried to portray this group as an innocent group, an angelic group, by giving the impression that all of its members are committed to finding a peaceful settlement to the crisis in Syria. And I wonder, how can such a group that has among its members countries that have financed and supported terrorism in Syria, how can they claim to protect Syrians? I will not go into the detail of the actions of every state. You are well aware of that. And I also wonder, this group, this entity, which includes members that financed, trained, and supported terrorism in Syria, how can such a group claim to be committed to protecting Syrian lives? A group that has among its members countries that have committed one aggression after the other against Syria. How can they claim to protect Syrians? This group that has among its members countries that supply terrorist groups with chemical weapons. I have discussed this matter yesterday in my statement before the First Committee, and I specified the country that provided these terrorist groups with chemical weapons, and I mean Turkey. How can this group that has among its members countries that issued jihadi fatwas in support of terrorism, how can it claim that it is protecting Syrians? Do you know that Al-Nusra Front refused to implement the Russian-Turkish agreement, which ended 3 days ago in Idlib? They refused to do that. And regarding Egypt, and I'm not trying to attack Egypt, I respect the Egyptian permanent representative. The leaders of Al-Nusra Front are mostly Egyptians and Turkish. They were sent by Morsi to Syria. They wanted to carry out their jihad in Syria. The religious leaders of Al-Nusra Front are now in disagreement with the political leaders of the Nusra Front. The religious leaders of Al-Nusra Front do not want to implement the Russian-Turkish agreement because they want the bloodshed to continue. How can a group that has among its members countries that occupy part of our territories, how can it claim to protect Syrian lives? French, Turkish, American and British forces are on Syrian territories. How can this so-called international coalition assist us while it occupies parts of our land? Mr. President, how can such a group, whose members have Syrian blood on their hands, how can they claim to protect Syrian lives? Instead of preaching in front of this council, we would like you to answer these questions. We need a clear position taken by the council against the presence of these illegal forces in our land. A position against terrorism, supporting terrorism, and respecting the Syrian government instead of creating a vacuum, a failed state, and helping in the proliferation of terrorism across the region. Mr. President, I find it necessary to remind some members of Article 2, Paragraph 7 of the Charter, which states, and I quote, "Nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state." End of quote. Maybe this article belongs to the Charter of Mars, not the Charter of the United Nations, because some members seem to have forgotten about it. The Syrian government has responded positively to all initiatives that would assist Syrians to end the crisis, as long as these initiatives would respect national principles, including the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and unity of Syria, while giving the Syrian people the exclusive right to determine the future of its country without any foreign interference, and while rejecting the presence of terrorism on Syrian territories. All of these beautiful words are in your resolutions on Syria. I did not make them up. This is what the resolutions of the Security Council state, and you have mentioned them today in your statements. The Syrian government engaged positively in the Geneva discussions, in the Astana process, and in the Sochi National Dialogue Conference. However, the other parties were the ones that stalled. They rejected dialogue. They invested in terrorism and in foreign interference, and they sought to undermine the sovereignty of Syria and its resilience. Today, we listened to the representative of the Netherlands stating a number of requirements and conditions. And he said, it is too early to talk about reconstruction, about the return of IDPs and refugees. It is too early to talk about lifting unilateral economic measures, coercive measures. It is too early to discuss the humanitarian situation in certain parts in Syria. And of course, this means that it is too early to discuss the fight against terrorism. Despite everything, the Syrian government continued to implement the outcomes of the Sochi Syrian National Dialogue on the formation of a constitutional committee to review the current constitution, because we do not want a constitutional vacuum, because Syria is not a failed state. The Syrian government presented a practical and comprehensive vision on the composition, prerogatives, and working methods of the committee, and submitted a list of representatives on behalf of the Syrian state to the special envoy. We stress that the mandate of the committee is limited to reviewing the articles of the current constitution through a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned process. We stress that the special envoy must respect his mandate as a facilitator of the committee. No preconditions should be imposed on the committee, nor should its recommendations be prejudged. The committee must be independent, since the Constitution and any relevant matter is a Syrian matter to be decided by Syrians themselves. Therefore, we will not accept any proposal that constitutes an interference in the internal affairs of Syria or that leads to such interference. We stand ready to work actively with our friends to convene the committee along the parameters I have just mentioned. Mr. President, my country welcomed the agreement reached in Sochi regarding the city of Idlib on the 17th of July, because we are committed to stemming the bloodshed. The agreement came as a result of intensive negotiations and consultations between Syria and Russia, and with full coordination between the two countries. We hope that this agreement will bear fruits, and we hope that the Turkish regime will carry out its end of the deal. We stress that this agreement is time-bound and includes clear deadlines. It complements all previous agreements on the de-escalation zones that were the result of the Astana process. The city of Idlib, ladies and gentlemen, just like any region in Syria, will return very soon to the sovereignty of the Syrian state. In order to achieve sustainable and durable peace in Syria, all illegal foreign forces must leave Syria, including Turkish, American, British, French, and Israeli forces. We consider all of these forces occupying forces. Their presence on Syria runs counter to the UN Charter, international law, and relevant Security Council resolutions on Syria. Mr. President, the Syrian government has never interfered in the internal affairs of any member state. It has always sought to respect and uphold the principles of the Charter and international law. We are seeking today to block any attempts of provocation and escalation in order to undermine our relations with the region and with the world. As a result, we have sought to reopen the Nasib border crossing with Jordan, and we will open other border crossings with Iraq soon. The progress made by Syria and its allies in the war against terror has led to a number of developments in Syria and in the region that must be taken into account in any discussion on Syria. It is time for those powers that support terrorism to review and reconsider their positions and to join in an international effort to stop supporting this heinous terrorist war. Supporting terrorism is a threat to international peace and security in the long and short run. It is time for all those detached from reality to wake up, to let go of their fantasies, and to come to their senses. They must realize that they will not achieve politically what they failed to achieve through terrorism. In closing, Mr. President, Syria continues to seek a Syrian political solution that would allow Syrians themselves to decide their future without any foreign interference in a manner that would ensure Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. Based on our respect for the role of the United Nations in facilitating Syrian dialogue, my country sent an invitation to the special envoy to visit Syria in the coming days to hold negotiations and discussions on issues related to his mandate. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Syria.